And good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to Dreamy Dreamland with your sensei. So, here it is, a beautiful day. Beautiful day. And what's there to worry about? Well, to put it in context of all the wars, environmental degradation, economic collapse, loss, all of the above. And what are you guys out there feeling? Oh, here we are in 1 minute. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to Dreamy Dreamland with your sensei, Bob. You're glad here to tell you a story through the shamanic window. Remember, are you a good bee or a bad bee? Just remember to do be. So, in most cultures and religions, they leave up the decision of what's right and wrong up to God. And here we have our good friend John Stewart.
He has such good looking nature.
Yeah.
So cute.
Like, I think most people would consider that somewhere in the realm of waste, fraud, or abuse, because they would wonder why that money isn't well accounted for. And especially when they see food insecurity on military bases, and they see...
You want to talk about that? Because that's a good... we should be talking... I mean, well, I'm trying to understand where you're trying to go, other than the dollars, which really bother you.
I think it doesn't really bother me. I think it's all connected.
And I think he's right about that, clearly. You know, there was a story that broke today, I believe it was. We're probably going to cover it tomorrow, but it's a leak of government documents pertaining to the war in Ukraine, and just how much the U.S. is pressuring other countries to supply weapons to Ukraine, lethal weapons to Ukraine. Anyway, I mention all of that because one of the hang-ups that Cenk and I have talked about in regard to the military aid that's being funneled to Ukraine it's not that we don't want to help Ukrainians. But at the same time, there is some concern that some of this military weaponry might end up in the wrong hands. If our Defense Department can't even account for 61% of their assets, how do we know that they are military weaponry that we're sending to Ukraine?
We lost tens of billions, maybe more, in Iraq and Afghanistan, where the Pentagon just came out and said, yeah, we don't know where the money went. Billions. Mm-hmm. Imagine if Medicaid had done that. Oh yeah, tens of billions went to poor people, but we don't know where it went. I mean, I think it went to poor people, but who cares, right? The right wing would destroy Medicaid. They would dismantle it within the week, right? The Defense Department steals billions of dollars, where they go and give it to their friends, who then they hire them later. And no, Kathleen Hicks, I don't trust you at all. See, this is what's wrong with American politics. Almost everyone on the left will go, oh, you can't say that about her. And I don't mean on the left, really, Democrats, libs, right? It will be like, oh my God, she's part of the Biden administration. And did you know she worked for Barack Obama? And he's an angel. No, she's another one of these bureaucrats. I mean, look at her flippant attitude. I mean, you guys seem so concerned about the money. Yeah, goddamn right we are. goddamn right we're concerned about $850 billion, and you can't tell me where 61% of it went because it went to your corrupt friends? No. I'm calling you what Jon Stewart's too polite to call you. You are corrupt. You are part of the corruption, and the Democratic and Republican administrations, they all are Jon Stewart. And by the way, the media is enormously complicit. They never challenge the defense budget. Anytime we say, Medicare for all, healthcare for everybody, just like in other developed countries, they're like, how are you going to pay for that? Defense budget? No. Yeah, just steal it. Steal our money. Steal it. We don't mind.
One more video.
When I see a State Department get a certain amount of money and a military budget be 10 times that, and I see a struggle within government to get people like more basic services, and then that department that got that, I mean, we got out of 20 years of war and the Pentagon got a $50 billion raise. Like, that's shocking to me. Now, I may not understand exactly the ins and outs.
An ideology which at its core states that all governance is about maximizing corporate profit at the expense of the citizenry. For what do we have structures of government? For what do we have institutions of state, if not to hold up all the citizenry and especially the most vulnerable? If you go back and look at the 1980s, in especially the Scandinavian countries, they eradicated poverty virtually. I lived in Switzerland. I studied French in Switzerland, and there were no homeless. The mentally ill were taken care of. It has arguably one of the best healthcare systems in the world. My oldest son was born in Lausanne. And that was, it's actually a privatized system, but it's heavily regulated. Everybody pays into it, but everybody has health insurance. Senior public school teachers earned about as much as doctors. And with the wealth given to us as Americans, we could have eradicated poverty. We could have created a country that was much different than what we have created. And what's happening now is that we are being rapidly reconfigured into a kind of neo-feudal society, an oligarchic society where increasingly the bottom 2/3 of Americans are hanging on by their fingertips. You have a shrinking, diminishing middle class and an elite that is just making obscene amounts of money at our expense. And you can't sustain, first of all, you can't sustain a democracy and an oligarchy. That's not a new idea. Thucydides wrote about that, about ancient Athens. But secondly, because there are no self-imposed limits, and in this sense, Karl Marx was right, that unfettered, unregulated capitalism, especially on a global scale, is a revolutionary force. They will push and push and push until there is a backlash. And I think part of what we're seeing with the security and surveillance state is a preparation for that backlash, the destruction of civil liberties, which has been brutal, the wholesale surveillance and monitoring of virtually every American citizen, which I think many of us suspected, and Edward Snowden, through his disclosures to Glenn Greenwald at the Guardian, made palpably real. The National Defense Authorization Act, and I sued the president in the Southern District Court of New York, and I won. We're now the Obama administration has appealed it, but this permits the military to seize, arrest American citizens, strip them of due process, and hold them in military detention centers, being our offshore penal colonies in places like Guantanamo or Bagram. And when Judge Catherine Forrest wrote her 112-page opinion, which I think is worth reading, she actually brings up the plight of the 110,000 Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II and stripped of due process, and said that this provision in the NDAA essentially allows the state to criminalize an entire group of people and lock them away without any legal redress. And they know what's coming. The NSA has run all sorts of scenarios on economic collapse and especially climate change, and they're preparing.
Let me add one thing to that. We did this in our coverage of the G20 protests in Toronto, where 1,000 people were arrested. Right. But I think there's pretty clear evidence that when they arrest 1,000 people in Toronto, when there's very little happening, right, this is dress rehearsal. This is training for how do you do
right,
mass arrests.
And it's also a message to everyone else. Let's remember that whatever the internal faults of the Occupy movement, and they were there, the Occupy movement was destroyed. And I was just at a trial in New York, Veterans for Peace, 25 people arrested. I was there in October 7th at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Plaza in New York, which technically closes at 10, but that's never enforced unless you're carrying out a public demonstration. That there is now a decision by the security and surveillance state to essentially seize all public space, to make any kind of protests within public space impossible, because they don't want to see generated another Occupy movement. And indeed, when many of these vets were arrested, the cops were telling them, look, we're vets, we don't want to arrest you, but the Occupy movement messed it up for you because we can't allow another one. The state was quite rattled by the Occupy movement and is determined not to allow a movement, a mass movement like that, to rise up again. And yet, you read Paul Krugman's columns in the New York Times, where he constantly calls for a rational response to the economic crisis. And a rational response would be moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions, a forgiveness of student debt, a massive jobs program, rebuilding infrastructure, especially targeted people under the age of 25. That would be rational. But the state...
It's not Ukraine. It's Ukraine as a part of NATO. NATO is the most violent, aggressive alliance in the world. Here we talk about it as a peacekeeping alliance. Really? Serbia, Iraq, Libya. What's the peacekeeping alliance? This is just recent years. NATO is a violent, aggressive alliance. Remember that NATO is the North Atlantic has recently been expanded to the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. They're part of the North Atlantic now. The last NATO summit, its mission was extended to the Indo-Pacific region. The idea is to enlist Canada, Europe, in the U.S. campaign against China. Actually, it was Vladimir Putin, apart from the criminality of the invasion.
A man named Ian Calder, I-A-I-N Calder. He was British, actually was Scottish, worked in the London bureau of the paper that he would ultimately work his career at. Then they brought him over to New York. He lived in New Jersey, worked in their offices in New York. And he was the journalist that had found this out and was pressing for the story because he thought it would be a very good one for his newspaper. Does anyone recognize the name Ian Calder? He, by the way, after becoming this reporter, worked his way up, and when he retired in the year 2000 from this newspaper, he retired as chairman and CEO of the entire corporation. This is a man with a lot of gumption. And this is him and his newspaper. Now, there's a very short portion of the story here that Ian Calder figures into. I'm gonna really boil it down, but it has importance beyond the Raleigh Call story. So I want you to know about this story. There was a man by the name of Abraham Bolden, and Abraham Bolden, among his other many positive qualities and accomplishments, President Kennedy, first African American Secret Service agent to work the White House detail. He was an extraordinary man, and when he was working in the Treasury, they said he closed more counterfeiting cases than anybody before him. He was brought over to the White House detail, and he was working on the White House detail at the time of the assassination, though not in Dallas. He was in Chicago, which is where he was living. And Abraham Bolden figures into this two ways. First of all, he gave a report that still exists that on the night of the assassination, on the night of Saturday, late Saturday night, remember the time that the call came through, the Raleigh call. Late Saturday night, a dispatch came through to the Chicago Secret Service office, and he assumed to all of them to research any information they might have about a man named Hurt or Heard, Heard. Didn't have anything, didn't report it. But the other aspect of Abraham Bolden that makes him a part of this is that he made statements to people he worked with and people he knew that he was going to testify to the Warren Commission about the lax performance of the Secret Service up to and including the time of the assassination.
Oh, you know what? Can I have a little more coffee?
Of agents being intoxicated at times that they were not supposed to be, of using agency cars to travel with women to parties, and all the things that actually we've been hearing about the Secret Service over the last little bit. He was going to tell people that. Well, he also said that he had evidence that at least one Secret Service agent had been at least peripherally involved with the planning or the outcome of the Kennedy assassination, and he was going to name the name. Imagine the surprise of all of us conspiracy people to learn that shortly thereafter, he was arrested on charges of soliciting a bribe from a counterfeiter that he was trying to put into jail. He was put into jail, and he was, you should read this for yourself, but he was exceptionally badly treated. His wife was threatened with weapons and followed. His children were trying to get him out and trying to get people to recognize that this was not a man that would take a bribe, but he was in fact convicted.
Our speaker tonight has written a number of books. He's loved and he's hated. I love him. Now, with that said, for a number of years, starting in '63, Robert, he would stand on Elm Street, and he had a little booth, and he would sell books. And what he believed, the evidence he's gathered at that time, and he's gathered lots more evidence since then, and he's still gathering evidence. He hadn't stopped. And
the assassination of Kennedy.
He's been arrested how many times? 77 times?
I was arrested twice, but ticketed 84.
Ticketed 84 times. And is it true that the last time that you were brought before the magistrate, he told the city of Dallas, quit this or I'll put you in jail yourself?
What he actually said was that what they're doing to me was violation of First Amendment rights, and it was federal. And he said we should go and sue in federal court, which we did. Took 7 years, but we won.
There you go. So don't mess with him. And one reason it caught my attention, his attorney, I barely knew in college. I went to Austin College, but anytime I see somebody who's gone to Austin College and they're in the paper, I want to read about them.
The president was shot in the throat. I took the actual autopsy photograph and I eliminated the tracheotomy. And this is what the president looked like when he was originally shot. This is after the tracheotomy. Dr. Perry utilized it to create a wound in the throat to insert a tracheal tube. The exit from the throat wound exited in the president's back up here at that point. Now, President Kennedy was hit in the back as well, exactly 2 seconds after the throat shot. At this point here, the president has clearly been hit. Now, Governor Connolly has not been hit. According to the single bullet theory, by now both men have been hit. The thing is, Governor Connolly, in his right wrist, is holding, in his right hand, he's holding this Texas-style Stetson hat. He could not.
At the National Security Agency, they called it the program. We are under emergency conditions.
Created after 9/11.
Extraordinary means are required to deal with the threat.
Collecting data on American citizens.
You're looking for unknown conspirators, and the way they devised to do that was to look at everybody.
Secrets at the highest levels of government.
A whole surveillance program without warrants designed for domestic surveillance. What we're doing is lawful, and I think is effective.
Through 2 presidencies.
This is a highly classified program. He was collecting the entire internet stream. He chose to keep the programs largely intact. That's not just data collection. That's digital surveillance.
I argued it was unethical, illegal, and unconstitutional. And when this comes out, all hell is going to break loose.
Tonight on Frontline, United States of Secrets, Part 1, The Program. The biggest leak of government secrets ever began in December of 2012 with a single email delivered to an IP address in Rio de Janeiro.
Glenn Greenwald, one of the world's busiest journalists, is sitting in his home in Rio, and he sees an email from someone he doesn't know. It's not a friend, it's not his mum, and it just says, "I've got some stuff you might be interested in."
He didn't use his name, and he said very cryptically and very vaguely that he had information that he wanted to discuss with me, but could only do so if I were to install encryption.
Guardian newspaper columnist and blogger Glenn Greenwald didn't pay much attention to the email.
99% of the time it ends up that they're crazy or delusional, or the story.
Are you looking to change your mood? Well, these are full spectrum infused gummies from Hello Mood. I've been trying mood products for about a month now, and all I can...
How's your mood?
3, 2, 1, 0. 60 seconds. I saw this illumination that was moving with respect to the stars. We were smart enough to not say, Houston, there's a light out there that's following us. So technically it becomes an unidentified flying object.
While Neil and Buzz were on the lunar surface, Neil switched to the medical channel and spoke directly with the chief medical officer, saying, they're here, they're parked on the side of the crater, they're watching us.
I spotted a lot of stuff that seemed to not belong on the moon.
And it has very distinct features of a satellite dish. It's got the dish itself, the crater shape. It's got a long spike that appears to come out of the middle. All sorts of stuff that looks exactly like a satellite dish on Earth looks.
There's an interesting picture on the moon that does appear to show something that could be a bridge, maybe a pipe, could be an inching worm.
I have no doubt that extraterrestrials could very well have populated or made structures on the far side of the moon.
The reaction of numerous space defense officials was fear and astonishment. And it would make sense that governments and military agencies might well be quaking in their boots, wondering who's built these structures, where are they from, what do they want?
There's one object that reminds people of a cooling tower from a nuclear power plant. Any species that could travel through the stars enough to put a base on the moon wouldn't have to blink before they could take care of us.
The other thing that is inside this lunar module looks like a woman, and this is the alien that they recovered from the ship. There was a study done by the Brookings Institute in the early 1960s, so before NASA went to the moon, there was sort of this idea that if not be able to handle it.
As the 45th anniversary of the Apollo 11 mission to the moon dawns, there are many mysteries about man's first lunar landing that remain unsolved. What did the astronauts actually encounter there? And what made NASA stop going back to the moon after Apollo 17? Is there evidence?
Did they? And what's going on? But don't worry, it's all Ducky. Well, these last two shows, you really haven't come on board or gotten involved. What time is it? It's not quite 1. Let's see if anybody wants to say anything. Yeah. They didn't answer. Well, anyway, I got things to do. I gave you enough to chew on. Um, I've done more than 2,000 shows, right? So come on, guys. Go take a look. There must be something there that tweaks your interest. And hell, you did a show on blah, blah, blah. And what do you think of that? Now, this is happening around me. What do you think of that? Anyway, I just wanted to reach out to you 25 minutes and 25 seconds. And I'll let you go. Okay?